Welcome to the Disaster Discussions podcast, where we explore the intersection of weather and the built environment. I'm your host, Rachel Goche, and I'm the newest meteorologist and science content producer here at IBHS. Big fan of the podcast. I had a chance to catch up on all the episodes on my road trip up here to South Carolina, so I'm really looking forward to continuing all of these great discussions. And I'm looking forward to jumping into today's topic, which is rating the states. So hopefully you had a chance to join our broadcast a few weeks ago, but if you didn't, we're going to dive deeper into rating the states today. And just a little background first before I introduce our guests. Rating the states is a report released every 3 years, and states are scored using a 0 to 100 point scale, and that is used to assess the state's building code adoption, implementation, and enforcement system toward mitigating damage from windstorms along the hurricane coast. Of course, the hurricane coast being those 18 states along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts that are most vulnerable to hurricanes. So you may be wondering who gives out these grades and how they're determined, and that leads me to the introduction of today's guests, those responsible for diving deep into the data to calculate those scores for each state. Here in the studio with me today, we have Dr. Milad Shabanian, Codes and Standards Engineer, and joining us remotely, Dr. Giammanco, Managing Director of Standards and Data Analytics. So welcome to the show, guys.
Hey, hello everyone.
And this is your first podcast as well as my first podcast as well. So
that's very great to be here with you today. A pleasure for mine.
Yeah, so looking forward to having this discussion with you two today. And before we dive a little deeper, I want to give a shout out also to IBHS staff members, applied statistician Hank Pogorzelski, as well as Eric Stafford, codes consultant. They both work with you and Ian very closely on putting this Rating the States report out. So a lot of hard work on their part as well. But I want to hear a little bit about each of your backgrounds. We'll start with Ian. Ian, you have a background largely in atmospheric science. And while we're discussing states along the hurricane coast today, we're going to talk about less about meteorology and more about the standards and data part of your job. So just tell me a little bit about the intersection of meteorology and data as it relates to rating the states.
Yeah, hey y'all, it's good to be back on the flip side. I had the opportunity to host one of these, so now it's nice to be back on the guest side. Yeah, a little bit about the data side. This is, we take a very meticulous approach to go collect a lot of information from all the states along our hurricane-prone coast that deals with how their building code program works, how they enforce their building codes, when do they adopt the codes, and also even down into getting into how folks are trained, both the building code officials, the contractors, the trades that are actually doing the construction work. So it's a big deal. So throughout 2023, we spend that time. So the year before we release our edition, we spend that whole year working through and collecting, I think it's something close to 48 different variables from each state along our hurricane-prone coast.
All right, and Milad, you're one of our building code gurus here at IBHS. You spend a lot of time traveling from state to state. You're involved heavily in our code proposal work, and you testify at a lot of code hearings as well. So just tell me a little bit about your background and how you came to work on rating the states.
Hey everyone, Rachel, I'm really originally from Iran. So I got kind of interested about civil engineering and building codes since when I was a kid. Iran is located in a very high seismically active area in the Middle East, and because of the experience with different earthquakes that I had, I decided to go to the earthquake engineering major. So I got my master from Iran. Then I came to the United States after having experiences with some building fires like 9/11 disaster, and after that fire incident in Iran, Glasgow building, and then wildfires that were happening here. I got into fire performance of buildings, and I have my PhD in basically fire performance of buildings. So that was when I got more familiar with IBHS, and I was very curious in the beginning about the research and cool stuff that we are doing here in the research center, and then after having some interviews with our chief engineer, Dr. Cope, I figured out that codes and standards is a very interesting section for me that it can help to have a huge impact on a larger scale of building. So
All
That
right,
was
really
hard.
cool.
Came
Yeah,
to
so
the
earthquakes, some fires. Of course, this is largely focused on wind damage. We're talking about the hurricane coast. So just a little bit of history about rating the states. I want to talk about that. But before we get into that, actually, I'm a former journalist here, so I really don't like to bury the lead. So in case you did not join us for our live broadcast a few weeks ago, just want to give you the top 5 and the bottom 5 states in our report. So the top 5 this year: Virginia, Florida, South Carolina, New Jersey, and Louisiana. And then the bottom 5: Delaware, Alabama, Texas, Mississippi, and Maine. So we'll get back to talking about quite a few of those states in just a little bit. The first report, though, first rating the states report, was released all the way back in 2012. Ian, I know you were here from the very beginning. So tell me a little bit about why IBHS decided to launch rating the states more than a decade ago.
Yeah, the original intent of rating the states was not as much about the rankings as we see today, but we all love a competition, right? And it's a great way to showcase how states have done different things in their code environment. But the idea was to take the lessons that we learned coming off of some really devastating hurricane events, going back to 1992 and Hurricane Andrew, all the way through the devastating hurricane seasons of 2004, 2005, and then 2008, to look at what were the factors that were influencing building performance from this overall system, the building code system. So not just the code itself, the enforcement, the training of the code officials that do the inspections, as well as the folks doing the building of our buildings. And the idea was to provide a guide to states about what they could do to improve that system. And so that was the original intent. So we developed the non-dimensional way to score it. And I want to give a big shout out to Hank on our team who really took that, developed the metrics along with our old chief engineer, Dr. Tim Reinhold, and Wanda Edwards, who was at the time our code specialist. They put the framework together to do what we do today. And it's worked. We've had 5 editions now. This now enables us to track how states are doing through time now. As policy changes, as building codes evolve, we're going to give it a pass this year to look to see, do we need to make some changes to the structure of it? But that was really what it was. It was to take a lot of those lessons learned from those devastating events and the factors that influence building performance in the field and see if we could actually use it to assess the overall building code system that's in place.
Yeah, needless to say, there's been a lot of storms since 2012, and it's been an active decade for sure. So definitely putting this report to use. And just talking a little bit about the mission of rating the states, like Ian mentioned, one of the goals is to provide a roadmap for those states to follow, either to develop or improve their building code systems. And then through our research here at IBHS, we know that having a strong building code can reduce the damage from natural disasters like hurricanes. And for homeowners that do live in a state with strong building codes, this adds some peace of mind, sense of security about the safety and soundness of their homes and workplaces. Everybody wants to feel safe in where they live and work. And then finally, a strong building code can help increase resilience and sustainability to improve the performance of the next generation of homes and businesses. Milad, can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, the code development cycle is a long 3-year cycle of basically updating the codes. And each time that we update the code, it gets stronger and better. From the research that we are doing here in the lab, other parties also, and what we are finding from positive and basically investigations, we kind of find the gaps in the code. So we focus more on those. And by submitting proposals, we are able to fill some of those gaps. We attend the code hearings, as you mentioned. We testify in support of those changes. It takes 3 years to have these basically science and basically positive investigations information fill the gaps in the code. So after 3 years, a new code will be updated. And we are looking here in rating the states to see how the states will basically perform by adopting, educating their enforcing agencies and also their contractors with this new basically informations. That's basically the process of the code.
So it doesn't happen overnight. A lot of people involved, lots of different factors. All right, well, I want to talk a little bit about the numbers, the methodology, and to calculate each state's score, you guys evaluate 47 different components. Those can be divided into three main categories: code adoption, code official training and education, and contractor licensing and training. So, Milad, how are these different categories weighted, and why do some categories carry more weight than others?
So the highest weight on this study goes to the code adoption. In that section, we have 50 points of the 100 points of our scoring system. And in that section, we look really into what are the codes and how is the code adoption basically system in the state. Then we look at the enforcement of that. Do they have a statewide enforcement or no? And in addition to these two major parts, we also look in the first part on how the wind provisions of the codes are basically defined in these states' codes. We have those model codes that are developed during the time, but when the states and locals will adopt these model codes, they will adjust those requirements based off their own basically interests and condition within the state. So we are looking into the wind provisions to make sure that these requirements are not weakened from the original model code. And then in the second part, which has 25 scores and points, we look into the education and continual education of enforcing agencies. We want to make sure that when these new information added to the code, and those enforcers of these codes will be also on the same page and are aware about these changes. Then in the third part, it's where we are looking to see, okay, now that we have a good code in place and our enforcing agencies are aware about this, how is our knowledge in the construction? How are the contractors performing? Are they aware about also these changes, and are they implementing those changes in their constructions? So in that part, we have 25 points. So in general, in total, we have 100, where half of it goes to the first section, and the rest of that is going to the second section.
And when you're analyzing these different components, the question you're really trying to answer is, does this promote safer residential construction? So if the answer to that question is yes, you give points. If it's no, then no points are given. So can you give me an example of one of those questions that you might ask when creating this report?
Sure. You know, if you follow the research that we were doing here in the lab, all those basically additional information and videos that we are basically putting outside for the media to cover, and we see a lot of gaps in the building construction methods. We saw the failures of garage doors. We saw the importance of having sealed roof deck. We care about the load path and how basically the strapping around the exterior walls to the roof connections are. We look at the foundations connections, and we consider all these parameters in our first part, which we review the wind provisions. We make sure that all those basically critical components of the building that are performing and increasing the resilience of buildings against wind are considered. So that's how we develop this. And garage doors are actually a good example. We saw a lot of failures in field. We tested them in the lab. We saw the same failure. Now we need wind-rated garage doors. It's in the code. We're trying to make sure that it's enforced properly.
Yeah, from that one, we know that when the wind is able to get into your home through the garage door area, you're more likely to have roof damage, right?
Yeah. Because of the change in the pressure of the interior parts of the building, we will have failures in many cases.
All right, so good information there. And I want to talk a little bit more about some of those individual states, the good, the bad, and the ugly, we'll call it today. I want to start with the bad. And some of the states along the Gulf Coast that often find themselves in the cone of uncertainty during hurricane season are actually at the bottom of our list: Texas, Mississippi, and Alabama. Down to my home state of Sweet Home, Alabama, that was ground zero for one of the most prolific tornado outbreaks in U.S. history. A lot of folks remember the April 2011 super outbreak when over 200 people died in Alabama in just one day. The big storm for the state of Alabama, hurricane-wise, there's a few, but Frederick back in the 70s, and of course Katrina, Ivan, Sally, just a few of the hurricanes that have affected Alabama. But the state still does not have a statewide building code. It's not all bad, though. We know down in Mobile and Baldwin counties on the coast, we actually have 48 1,000 homes with fortified home designation. Those are those roofs built to be more resilient to those high winds. And about 80% of our fortified designations are in the state of Alabama. So we saw the success of this when Hurricane Sally made landfall in 2020, and 95% of those fortified homes saw little to no damage. So the coast is leading the way for what the rest of Alabama could be, but some big differences there between the coast and the inland areas. So Ian, we know that when you do build to a standard, it works, right?
Yeah, we've seen it now play out. The best and probably latest example is Hurricane Ian in Southwest Florida, where the modern Florida building code built homes. We assessed 455 of them, and we've talked about that on this show before. We didn't observe any structural damage. Now, the event itself was encroaching on the design limit, but it also tells you that the code itself has the right provisions and its design levels are set correctly. And it works. If you break it into dollars and cents and you just sort of estimate the broad scope of damage to just single family homes alone, you're looking at likely somewhere between $1 to $3 billion in savings. But you also have now homes that were damaged that now have to be repaired, especially when we were dealing with roof systems, that will be basically upgraded to the latest code, which gives you an immense degree of protection now. We even stumbled across, in just scanning Google Earth imagery, one of the homes that we assessed was getting a new roof put on, and it's on Google Earth, and you could see the sealed deck being put down by the roofer. And it just makes you think, like, hey, every time these events happen, it's so important that this system of protections is actually in place so things like this can happen. So the growth in the positive benefit will just keep growing exponentially as these events happen. But it's also why it's so important, and the stuff we're talking about today is put in place before the events happen so it can work its magic in the future.
Yeah, Louisiana, one of those states doing exactly that, which we'll get to just a few minutes. Continuing on, though, with their bad list, Texas ranked 16 out of 18. Texas, of course, the largest of the lower 48 states. They're part of the traditional tornado alley, home to multiple perils. We've got hurricanes, severe convective storms, tornadoes, even blizzards from time to time out in the Texas Panhandle. Texas, we know, is a home rule state, so there is no mandatory adoption and enforcement of a code. Texas, one of those states never really afraid to do its own thing. Thoughts on Texas?
Yeah, Texas, I spent 7 years at Texas Tech out in West Texas doing my master's and PhD. And Texas is its own place. It is a home rule state. So the code adoption, all of the entire system trickles down to the local level. So it is up to really the city level of government to put in all the things we're talking about here today as codes, but also the building code officials, training, education, all that fun stuff is all back there. And Texas, if you look, you have to drill down locally to sort of understand what's going on. So in the history of rating the states, because of this, it scores very low. And to give an example of sort of what's going on, if you zoom into the upper Texas coast, so Houston, the city of Houston has adopted the latest 2021 International Residential Code. They do a pretty good job in code provisions. But if you just go one county to the southwest of Harris County down to Brazoria County, there's a few towns in there that do have codes, but there's the majority of that county in the unincorporated areas that don't have a code at all. One of the glaring issues that we've seen was even at a place like Sugar Land, Texas. If we rewind the clock back several years, Sugar Land was one of those that was unincorporated and didn't have a code while it was undergoing one of the largest suburban growths in our urban centers that we've seen. And so you have all of those homes now being built under this kind of lacking code regime. And it's not just the lack of the code piece. It's really, when you put this kind of patchwork together, you start to have problems with enforcing or even knowing what you're supposed to be using. We saw this after Hurricane Andrew in 1992. There was like 21 different variants of codes that affected the wind performance that could have been applied in South Florida at the time. And when you create this sense of confusion, builders don't know what they're building to, inspectors don't know what they're supposed to inspect to, and then just nothing happens. It becomes, analysis paralysis at that point. And it was a part of the ingredients that led to a catastrophic outcome in South Florida all those years ago. So that's our biggest concern when it comes to Texas. The fact that this trickles down to the pure local level gives you this very scattered patchwork of code adoption enforcement. And there is a serious concern that this could be a catalyst or part of the ingredients should one of those big storms find its way to the Texas coast.
Yeah, and I just want to, kind of throw in, we know Texas, one of the fastest growing states as far as population. A lot of people are moving from other parts of the country to Texas, particularly to the Houston area. Of course, they're affected by hurricanes. So how do we think this growth happening in Texas could play into the next big storm with this kind of, you mentioned, patchwork of building codes, Ian?
Yeah, I think it becomes very important for folks in that part of the country to know where they understand where you live and what code may or may not have been put in place. But it also gives you the opportunity to push on your local government to make sure that they have adequate codes adopted and do a little investigation yourself. But I tell you what, from past events, this is what really does worry us, that there is this issue could crop up in the worst way. And unfortunately, we watched that happen in Hurricane Andrew in 1992, but we also see this happen in tornadoes time and time again, where you have this trickle down to the local level. You see substandard construction way too frequently. And I guess that's probably our biggest fear. And it's not just Texas. Texas is just one example. And you see that actually across the bottom third of the states that now are very consistently in the bottom of rating the states.
Yeah, Mississippi, another one of those states. And we do want to give a shout out here. Mississippi has increased its score by 40 points since the inception of rating the states, but they still receive a failing score. Mississippi, of course, home to Hurricane Camille back in '69, just one of a handful of Category 5 storms to hit the U.S. So, Ian, my question for you is those bottom states, Alabama, Mississippi, and Texas, why do you think they've still failed to enact statewide building codes, even in the wake of some major disasters? And I'm curious to know if and how politics plays a role in this discussion and to what extent.
So it's long been that a lot of these states have really shied away from the regulatory action that would come with that. And so they put the onus down to the local level. In Texas, a little different story. Texas is a big state, but Rachel, you mentioned it. They deal with every form of windstorm. So the provisions we talk about today apply just as easily in tornadoes and derechos, things like that. Alabama got very close to getting a statewide building code across the finish line last year. They came up a little bit short in terms of getting that legislation passed. But I think what we're watching is sort of a bit of change in mindset as the losses mount up, not just from hurricanes, but severe convective storms as well. And we've also seen federal funding through disaster relief and things like that, and grants start to become tied to building codes as a nudge factor to try to get some of these state governments over the hump. Now, some of it's budgetary. Standing up new codes departments absolutely costs money, and you have to balance where you're going to put your money from a state level to develop those programs. But unfortunately, one of the worst things we do see happen is you now, though, force local jurisdictions to have to pick. And this is something that we talked about a while back in one of our On the Radar podcasts in the Rolling Fork, Mississippi tornado. So you look at some of the rural counties in Mississippi, you're basically asking some of these counties to pick between their roads or their codes. And that's just simply not a place you should put them in a position to have to make that choice. And that's why IBHS, you will always hear us advocate. And that's why it's scored the way it is in rating the states for a statewide uniformly enforced building code. So that's just some of the nuggets that we unfortunately run across in the bottom third of the states that we include in. And unfortunately, that bottom has been about the same for all 5 editions now.
All right, I want to turn to the ugly now. North Carolina, our research neighbors just to the north. They dropped from number 7 to number 8 on this report, but they may drop even lower in the next report 3 years from now. What do you want to tell me about that?
So I'll start, but I'm going to kick it over to Milad to cover. They did two primary actions, and I'll start with the first, which was a legislative action that halted the adoption of new building codes through 2031. This was through an overridden veto. So Governor Roy Cooper vetoed this bill. It got overrode and went into effect. This only cost the state 1 point in this current edition because they still, we scored this over time, right? So as this progresses, they'll continually start to lose some points there. But as we look back over the history of rating the states, no state has enacted, at least in the 12 years we've been doing this kind of long-term moratorium on code adoption. We saw some states pause their code adoption during the COVID pandemic. We've seen states sort of go to a 6-year adoption cycle rather than 3, but no one went this far. And what sort of drove it was concerns over the cost of construction in the chapter related to energy efficiency. But the problem was when you do that, you put a halt to all the other benefits. And there's also a reverse. People talk about like, hey, I want to, we could just take that chapter out or put it somewhere else or kind of chop up our codes a little bit. Well, that's just like the same problem of local adoption that we saw in Hurricane Andrew. When you start cutting up the code into 15 different versions, you're going to create the exact same confusion. So we don't want that to happen either. So that was the big legislative action, and it really has been one of the most substantial actions taken by a state legislature on the negative, just from the duration of this moratorium that we've seen in the 12 years we've been doing this. Now, they did some other things about reducing some of the hurricane protections that are out there in some of the most vulnerable areas. I'm gonna ask Milad to speak a little bit about some of the changes they made when it comes to the windborne debris protections, which has a lot to do with about protecting windows, openings, garages, things like that. So, Milad, I'll let you jump in here.
Oh, thank you, Ian. Actually, as a person who was living in Charlotte, North Carolina, it was very disappointing for me when I saw that type of action happen at the governor level. But with the hurricane requirements, as I mentioned, we look at different parameters, right? We look at the window protection, opening protections, garage doors. Around the hurricane coastal line and hurricane-prone areas, one of the issues that we have are windborne debris. So there are windborne debris that are flying around in these high velocity wind speed zones. And in North Carolina, what happened is that they changed the definition of windborne debris regions. So now there are many locations, and because of that change, many of those locations that were supposed to be built with appropriate protection for the openings are now going to be constructed without that required protection, which is going to put many of those counties that are located around the coastal lines in danger of having basically failures caused by failure of the opening. So that was the major, basically, weakening amendment that we saw in North Carolina.
Well, hopefully we'll have, hopefully something will change between now and the next report. But I want to move on to the good now. And we do have plenty of good things to talk about. Best part of the report, of course, the states with the highest rankings. And I want to highlight Louisiana first. And for the first time, they were in the top 5 with a 9-point jump up to a score of 91. One of the most improved states this year. So, Milad, tell me a little bit more about how Louisiana gained those points.
Louisiana actually adopted recently, not recently, last year, the latest edition of IRC, which was at the time 2021 edition. But they didn't stop there. Even like they went beyond the code. They also strengthened their code by adopting parts of our fortified standard program. So right now, the nailing pattern of the fortified is adopted and amended to the Louisiana code. They also did some improvements in their education for the inspectors and basically enforcing agencies that caused a raise in their score to this point.
And I want to quote one of our special guests we had from the Rating the States broadcast this year, Jackie Danikas, Chief Executive Officer of Green Coast Enterprises out of New Orleans. So just to kind of paraphrase what she said during that show, she said, quote, "The more roofs we can fix right now, proactively before the next storm, the better and stronger our response is going to be. The goal is that we can stay in our houses and know we're going to be safe through those storms and know that we're going to be able to continue on with our lives after those storms without having major damage and repairs required to get back to our lives. So as we know, there's been a lot of disruption. I just recently moved here from Louisiana. I was there for those historic storms in 2020 and 2021, back to back, Hurricane Laura, Hurricane Ida, along with several others, major storms for Louisiana, lots of disruption from the coast of Louisiana all the way up, even into central Louisiana, a lot of disruptions. So they did have no tropical activity the last 2 seasons in Louisiana, no landfalls. And last year even, it was a really big deal. It even made some headlines in some of the newspapers in Louisiana. Didn't make it into the cone of uncertainty at all last hurricane season for the first time in a few years, of course. So Louisiana really used that lull to start that grant program to start fortifying those roofs. So, Ian, we do expect to see a different outcome along the Louisiana coast after the next hurricane. And we know that is bound to happen eventually thanks to those fortified roofs. What do we think this is going to do for Louisiana?
Yeah, I think Louisiana definitely is in this for the long haul now. They're committed to doing this. They took a lot of the pieces and parts that have been shown to be successful in neighboring Alabama and coastal Alabama and put them to use. Louisiana, if you look back over the history of raiding the states, they've often made these stair-step changes. And some of those came after really the first edition of raiding the states, but that was coming on the heels of really, think back to 2008 and Hurricane Gustav. Hurricane Isaac happened in there. You know, we always say just a Cat 1. Well, Isaac produced damage that in some places that was exceeded what we saw in Katrina due to rainfall and storm surge. So there's those events that drive those stair steps. If you look at a place like Florida, you know, after Hurricane Andrew, they just ripped the Band-Aid off and went after it all at once. Louisiana has made these two marked sort of stair steps, and it is the events that are the catalyst, and it's often, though, that window of time after events where everybody can sit down and want to work together to make things like this happen. And I applaud my home state. Rachel, you've lived in Louisiana for a chunk of time, and I grew up in Baton Rouge. For them really deciding that they were going to go the extra mile. We have never seen a state not only put in these code updates to their code system, but they also put in a fortified home grant program almost simultaneously. So they really decided, hey, we got to put a stop to this. And it will only, like everything we talk about, these actions will amplify with time as more and more buildings get constructed to these standards, and that ecosystem really starts to again, I said work is magic. It will, and it will for the storms to come.
Yeah, we know Louisiana is bound to see another storm eventually. I feel like Louisiana finally just said, enough is enough. It took quite a few storms to get there to this point, but that 2020-2021 season was just really absolutely unbelievable as someone living in the state during that time. So also want to talk about, of course, Florida. They've consistently been near the top of the list since the inception of raiding the states. They remain there, 95 out of 100 points. Still a little bit more room for improvement, but we have to highlight a huge win in Florida. And Ian, you did talk about it a little bit earlier, but talk about some of the things you looked back on after Hurricane Ian in Florida.
Yeah, we took a really deep look at building performance in Southwest Florida after Hurricane Ian made landfall, and that included assessing sort of how the modern Florida building code did, and most of that system that we see today really started in 2002. So that's when you hear IBHS talk about the modern Florida building code, it really began in 2002. Its first test was Hurricane Charlie in 2004, which gave us a glimpse into how good this system could be. And then Hurricane Ian proved it again. Irma did as well. As you look back at some of the Florida hurricanes, unfortunately, these two ice storms, of course, were in there. And you saw how their investment in this code system, which is actually, it is very centralized at the state level, but it has worked. And it's done a marvelous job at preventing significant structural damage to homes. Now, there are places, like all code systems, there's room for improvement. They have some room to improvement on some of their training and licensure provisions, things like that. But there's also new things in code that even IBHS had a hand in a proposal to help with the attachment of soffits and fascia. And it hadn't been implemented in time to get, to see any benefit from Hurricane Ian, but it was a place where we actually saw some damage on modern Florida building code built homes. So this is the building envelope elements. So there's the places where I think you're going to see Florida improve the most. I think they may try to, add a little bit to their training programs to grab a few extra points, but you could also envision that they'll move even further in protecting the building envelope. So from the roof to the wall cover, the soffits and fascia and everything in between. And those are the things that start to also add up in less dollar losses. And we can look at total, structural damage that often could be a total loss in terms of a dollar value of a home. But you're going to see us move into that arena. And I think Florida's probably going to lead the way in terms of looking at some of those elements about the building envelope. So again, kudos to Florida, hung tight with the 95. It's just our state not that far away from us in south of North Carolina at the IBHS Research Center right up the road in Virginia. They just got 1 point better. So again, kudos to the state of Florida, again, staying near the top with a 95 score.
All right, and of course, Virginia taking the #1 spot this year. We had to save the best for last, of course, up to 96 points. That was a record high score for rating the states. And I want to just rehash another quote. Another one of our special guests we had on the broadcast this year was Cindy Davis, Deputy Director of Building and Fire Regulations with the Virginia Department of Housing and Community Development. Now, she was asked by Ian how they've used rating the states and the work being done here at IBHS. So to paraphrase what she said, we use it in so many ways. It has been so helpful for us. When you talk to consumers, they don't necessarily get excited about building codes. But when you start talking about the importance of community and economic development and how it impacts insurance rates and how it affects them personally, then they become more engaged in the process and they pay more attention to what's happening in the realm of building codes and where they live, work, and play. So Cindy really highlighting how that data in rating the states impacts Virginia citizens. So before we close out today's episode, just some final thoughts on Virginia and rating the states as a whole before we wrap up this discussion on the 5th edition of the report.
Yeah, Virginia, a great story. Record score of 96, and it was a pleasure to really be the first to congratulate Cindy and her team. They put their effort into developing what is the best code official training, enforcement, and education program there is on the Hurricane Coast. That was where they gained those points. They also were able to get off of they had skipped a code cycle during the COVID pandemic. They were able to easily get over that, except there came a little bit of a suspense right at the end as there was a very subtle effort to again pause the code adoption cycle. That was easily defeated within the committee voting system that they have. And Virginia, because of it, stayed up at the top, got the couple of extra points through their code official education training program. And it's a great story. They do their system a bit differently than Florida, but they're another model that can be used. And again, if any of the states out here are looking to revamp their code official training and education program, Virginia is a great place to look. And they have developed over time the best system that we see today along the Hurricane Coast. So congratulations to Cindy and her team and the entire state of Virginia for doing a marvelous job and setting a record. So we'll see if Florida can catch them. Right behind those two is South Carolina at number 3. We've seen that top 3 now for really most of the editions of Rating the States. But you got Louisiana closing in, and that's sort of the look. We've covered it from the top to the bottom. So Milad, I'll let you jump in. You did a lot of the data work behind this. I want you to give us a sense of what all this means to you.
Well, what we saw in Virginia was very promoting for me. Like during the process of digging for data, like collecting the information, we usually go and refer to the building department's website. And Virginia is one of those locations. They did a great job in providing information. They have very well established basically website for training and education. The code development process in Virginia is very similar to what we see in ICC and model building codes. They have a we CDP Access website for submitting proposals. Everything is trackable in a very easy way. So I enjoyed working on Virginia State's basically data collection part because it was very interestingly designed and very helpful. So kudos to the people involved in the process and development of that basically platform and the whole basically building code department of Virginia. It was amazing to go through their information.
So our next Rating the States report will be out in 2027, correct?
Mm-hmm.
I'm assuming you guys you're probably already working on it.
Yeah,
Or you'll get to work soon.
we are planning to basically we look at the criteria itself this year, and we usually start gathering and collecting the information a year before releasing the document. So next year we will work on data collection part, but this year is more on updating the criteria, considering new ideas and basically states into the report. So
All right. Well, we look forward to seeing that next report. And Dr. Milad Shabanian, Dr. Ian Giammanco, our guests on the podcast today. Thank you both so much for joining us. And thank you for joining us for this edition of the Disaster Discussions podcast. Be sure to join us next time here at the IBHS Research Center for our next episode.
Thanks for listening to the Disaster Discussions podcast, an IBHS production. Subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast app, or watch the podcast on our website at ibhs.org/Disaster Discussions podcast and the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety YouTube channel. Connect with us on our social media pages on Twitter at Disaster Safety, Facebook at facebook.com/Disaster Safety, and on Instagram at IBHS_org. For more great content from IBHS, including ongoing research efforts happening at our facility, episodes of our podcast, and more, visit ibhs.org.